Father in heaven, thank you for this new day. Thank you that we can come together and study these things. I pray, Lord, that we'll find a firm platform beneath our feet, that we'll understand the movement that we're in, the messages that we're required to accept at this time. I pray that we won't be shaken out of these, Lord, but that we will be firm for what is coming. I pray, Lord, that you'll grant us an understanding and a wisdom when it comes to these matters. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. I just want to review the conclusion we came to yesterday regarding our fifth line. We take the line of the 144,000, it's our template. We would talk about a ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest. That's our template. We bring it down to the reform line of the priests, and what I've done is instead of moving it across, we'll just bring it underneath. This is the way when some people like to draw their reform lines in different ways depending on how it's easier for it to stay in your mind. So the priests, 1989, 9/11, 2014, 2018, 2019, Panium. And remember what we started by trying to understand. We have Raphia, Panium, Sunday law. And when we call Raphia midnight and Panium midnight cry, who's being cried to? Who's that message for? We come to the Levites and we move it one across. 9/11, 2014, 2019. Their loud cry, Panium, Sunday law. So Panium goes from a second advent to a close of probation. For the Nethinims, we move it one across. 2014 is their time of the end. 2019, Panium, there'll be a loud cry, Sunday law, close of probation. So Panium can be a second advent, close of probation, or Sunday law. But whenever we come to a midnight cry or a loud cry, it's this smaller waymark in between that leads to a close of probation. Can we see that? So when we see Panium as a midnight cry, this was the line that we did with Acts 27 and the ship. And when we looked at the ship, the first line began in 1989, but if we see the whole story of that ship, where does it begin? 1798. And none of these lines begin in 1798. When we came to a story from 1798 that's about this ship, what did the ship represent? The United States and Adventism. And when we traced its journey from 1798, we could do it through 1844, 1863, 1989. And we traced its journey, and then we found the following pattern. We had 9/11 to Sunday law, and between 9/11 and Sunday law we have two waymarks. And these waymarks have all the characteristics of an increase of knowledge. An angel comes down, and a midnight cry, all the characteristics of an exodus. Boston, Concord, Exeter. And if we have two waymarks between 9/11 and Sunday law, and we see Sunday law as a shut door, for the ship it's a close of probation. It makes Raffia and Panem a midnight and a midnight cry. But it's a midnight and a midnight cry for these two institutions. Can we see that? This is a separate line to the ones of the four that we've been drawing up, because the 144,000 is a group of people at the end of the world. The priests are a group of people at the end of the world, as are the Levites and the Nethinims. These four are all about the experiences of different groups of people that are being called and chosen. This reform line is about two institutions that are both raised up as some form of protection for these groups of people. And these institutions, in their job function, as what they're meant to do, they bring us right to where they're meant to. They fulfill their job function, which is to get us to Sunday law, but there's serious problems within them. And we can particularly highlight that in the history of the American Civil War. And it's for those institutions that there's a reform line and a close of probation, judgment. So that's just the review that I wanted to pick up that point. Are we all okay with that? And I will rub it out. When it comes to a camp meeting, it really becomes impossible to share the information in a proper kind of systematic fashion and cover it adequately. So it becomes a hard decision to know what to cover and what not to cover. What I'm hoping to do at camp meetings is not so much give the material and repeat what was done in Arkansas. I'm hoping that people have followed past Arkansas. Arkansas was the groundwork for a much bigger message, and it's impossible for that message to continue to be repeated in every detail. Much of that has to stop being taught, and it has to be accepted that people have been watching Guadeloupe and Portugal and Romania and Brazil, and that they are already familiar with how this message has grown. If they haven't, they cannot wait for a camp meeting to catch up. It is not going to happen. If people are waiting for Germany to hear about World War II, we're not covering any of this in Germany. That's new material. So there is a very strong need to keep up. This movement that you want to be baptized into is a movement. It's moving. It can move at the pace of the slowest, but if the slowest is willfully not following, they are left behind. That becomes an act of choice. And if you follow the teachers and the leaders that I'm seeing in this movement, many of them are becoming tired. Yep. They cannot do the work of educating every person when there's everything that's already done with camp meetings and schools and YouTube. Everything's already out there. That's an individual work people have to choose to do. So there is a great deal of material that cannot be retaught here. It's already out in the public record, and that becomes a personal choice whether or not people want to access that. So I'm going to skip large parts of information, and I'll try to tell you when I am doing that, so that you can, if you want to fill in those gaps, go back to one of those previous presentations. I want us to consider the reform line of Christ. You can do all kinds of applications with this reform line. I want you to consider the following. If we were to see the reform line of Christ, it begins at his birth. And then we have his baptism. You can go to the story of Acts 27 and you can see its overall structure of that second ship based on how you're placing three groups of people. The message moves in three distinct phases. So when you come to the reform line of Christ, first of all, you have Christ and the disciples. First of all, there's one group called out, and they're trained. They're given specific training. You have birth and baptism. You come to the triumphal entry, and then the cross. I want to suggest that's all the first group of people. This is all the training of one core group who are meant to do a work. Once the disciples are trained, they go through this refining process, and then what? Pentecost. And what are they doing? Who are they taking the message to? The Gentiles? No, it's back to the church. They're trained to reach the church. So first one group, and then a second group, till 34 AD, and then what happens? Then they go to a third group. And this is the Gentiles. So primary application. Where's the cross on our reform line? For you and for me, where's the cross?
In the middle. Sunday law.
Who are we going to at Sunday law? Gentiles. We're not going to the Gentiles here, we're going back to the church. Actually, they don't go to the church here, they need some time in the upper room. They've got some problems they need to sort out. A bit more training. What's the cross? If this is the time of the end, and this is 9/11, and this is the loud cry or the midnight cry in 2018, what's the cross? For who? Because we have many closes of probation. If it's the close of the probation for the Jews, then why are they going back to them here? This is Raphia. This is November 9, 2019. Pentecost, 34 AD. Then you can start seeing this work for the church. What I want us to see is if we take the whole history of Christ and the disciples of the end of ancient Israel, the cross is Raphia. It is specifically the close of probation, not for the Jewish nation or for the world, but for this group of people. So when we think about the experience of the cross, that's what we're coming to. In its primary application, it's speaking about 2019 at the end of the world. I want us to keep that in our minds because we're going to come back to that. We have to make sure we know where we are in that story. We have to take seriously the history that we're currently walking through. So I don't want to repeat the history of Pyrrhus. We've been repeatedly doing that for the last 8 months. I just want to highlight a couple of points we get from that. We go from Acts 27 to the history of Pyrrhus. And what do we notice about the history of Pyrrhus? How many parts does it come in? 2 parts. First, he conquers out of Macedonia. And this is where he tries to establish his empire. How well does that go for him? Badly. And then he tries to establish an empire in Italy. So the first thing we notice when we go to the history of Pyrrhus is that's in 2 parts. First Macedonia and first Italy. What we notice is he has an alpha history and an omega history. We took the history of Pyrrhus, we go into the history of the kings of Pyrrhus, and what do we notice?
There's a
How many of them? To Pyrrhus. From the first to Pyrrhus, what number is Pyrrhus? The 10th. So not to repeat it, but to remind us, we're trying to understand Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus, we can demonstrate, is the king of the south. We go to the leaders of Pyrrhus and we see that of his nation, the first is Admetus. Pyrrhus is the 10th. Then we see that there's a period of time where he co-rules, and then he returns. And he represents the king of the south in our day. We took this history, we bring it to another. We see the king of the south in our day is Vladimir Putin. If you go back 10 from Vladimir Putin, who do you come to? Stalin. Putin serves 2 consecutive terms. Under their constitution, cannot run for a third. So what did he do? Co-ruled. That was not hidden. It was wide open that there were 2 leaders of Russia, Medvedev and Putin. They even made it their campaign slogan, "Together we stand." They co-ruled. Medvedev dutifully stood down and Putin came back, facing the largest protest that Russia has had since the fall of the Soviet Union, when he said that he was coming back as president. They knew they had a dictator set up. So we already start to see a repeating pattern. And then we traced Aeacides, his father, who falls in a coup. A rival takes the throne before Aeacides comes back. Aeacides is killed. He's too much weakened by the insurrection caused by his rival. He's weakened and removed, and his brother takes the throne. And what's the problem with his brother Alcetus? No self-control. He loses the respect of his people. They depose him and they place Pyrrhus as a young boy, very inexperienced. We take this down to this history and we start filling in this gap, and we identify Gorbachev. Gorbachev was removed in a coup. A rival took the presidency. Gorbachev took it back, but he'd lost so much power in that coup, the Western leaders no longer had any respect for him, and his own people were tired of it. So he resigns. When he steps down, it's the end of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin took power, and what's the problem with Boris Yeltsin? No self-control. And what did that impact? His health. By the time he stepped down, he was also stepping down because of his health. He was a very sick man. And when you have Putin take the presidency, comparatively inexperienced like anyone who'd come before, he'd only been involved in state politics for about 3 years. Local politics a bit longer. If we were to go backwards from Stalin, you see Tsar Nicholas. When Tsar Nicholas is deposed, what ends? The monarchy. And then in comes Lenin. What's Lenin's problem? His health. His health forces him to retire from an active role in the government. Lenin places Stalin. He lives to regret it. Boris Yeltsin resigns because of his health. He placed Vladimir Putin in power. He lived to regret it. Both of them placed dictators. Lenin placed Stalin. Boris Yeltsin placed Vladimir Putin. Both retired from government because of their health failing. When Tsar Nicholas stepped down, he ended the monarchy. When Gorbachev stepped down, he ended the Soviet Union. You can do really neat parallels to see the similarities between Stalin and Putin. This is where you start to see secular authors come in that are ploughing the Nethinims. They're able to identify Trump as Hitler, but they're also saying Vladimir Putin is a repeat of Stalin. And they do that by going right back to his upbringing, how he was brought up, his training, how he thinks, how he rules. Even those that love Stalin and love Vladimir Putin show the similarities between them. So, using this structure that we've done just the basic outline of, we're able to see that Pyrrhus comes in an Alpha and Omega history. And if Pyrrhus is Putin and Putin is Stalin, then Pyrrhus is also going to tell us both Alpha and Omega histories. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So Pyrrhus comes in Alpha and Omega. Therefore, the King of the South in our time comes in Alpha and Omega. And we can see that with this model. So if we're going to see an Alpha history of the King of the South in our time, it's going to be the history of Stalin and World War II. And our history under Vladimir Putin. So Pyrrhus's history in Macedonia illustrates the history of World War II. And when you line up Pyrrhus's experience in Macedonia, you can see clearly the repeat of the events in World War II, right from the invasion of Poland, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Operation Barbarossa. Everything here is repeated here. So we know that everything in the history of Italy is repeated in our time with Vladimir Putin. So we have these Alpha and Omega histories. The Alpha of the King of the South and the Omega of the King of the South. And this is what we would have spent a lot more time laying out if we had more time. But it has been done. So when we take an Alpha and Omega history, this is nothing new. We do this all the time. We take the history of Moses, an Alpha history of ancient Israel, and the history of Christ, the Omega history of ancient Israel. Then we take the history of the Millerites, an Alpha history of modern Israel, and the history of the 144,000, the Omega history of modern Israel. And what do we do to them? We overlay. So we're going to not only learn about our time from the history of Christ, we're also going to learn of our history from the line of Moses and the line of the Millerites. So all of these three histories teach us about the reform line of the 144,000. Can we see that? Yeah. So when we want to understand this history, we're not just going to take Italy, we need to take Macedonia and World War II. So what I want to do as an introduction to this subject is to just consider not the whole history, but the relevant battles. If we were to draw up a chart, and what we're going to do is we're going to overlay these four histories. So this first box here This is Pyrrhus's Alpha history in Macedonia. So this is Pyrrhus in Macedonia, and it's an alpha. Then we have Pyrrhus in Italy. It's an omega. And then we have World War II. It's an alpha. We have World War III, our history, it's an omega. Pyrrhus in Macedonia starts with the Battle of Ipsus. What's particularly unusual about the Battle of Ipsus? What's its special characteristic? Yes? I'm thinking about who's fighting who. Who's friends? There's an alliance. World War II starts with an alliance. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The invasion of Poland. We take that down and we overlay it over 2014. It's not, and here also with Pyrrhus in Italy, you can also see a treaty. It isn't really this first history that I'm wanting to discuss. What I'm wanting us to see is these three battles where there isn't a union between the King of the North and the King of the South. I want us to see them when they're fighting. When we go to Pyrrhus in Macedonia, it starts with the conflict between the King of the North and the King of the South starts with an invasion. This is the invasion of Thessaly. Then there is an invasion of Epirus. And then there is an invasion of Macedonia. In the invasion of Thessaly, who's our two players in this history? Who's the King of the North? No, not Rome. That's this history. Who's the King of the North in this history? Demetrius. So in this history we have Demetrius versus Pyrrhus, King of the North, King of the South, and they're fighting. At the invasion of Thessaly, who instigates that conflict? The South, Pyrrhus, who wins? The North. Then there's the invasion of Epirus. Who instigates that? The North, and who wins? Who wins? The North. And then the invasion of Macedonia. Who instigates that? The South. And who wins? The South. So the South attacks the North wins. The North attacks the South wins. The South attacked the North and the South won. Now we come down to Pyrrhus in Italy. And we have three battles between Rome and Pyrrhus. First is the Battle of Heraclea. Then is the Battle of Asculum. And then is the Battle of Beneventum. At the Battle of Heraclea, who comes against who? Who came against who? Rome came against Pyrrhus. The North attacked the South, and who won? The South. Asculum? Pyrrhus attacked the North, and who won? The South. Beneventum, who attacked who? The North attacked Pyrrhus, and who won? The North. World War II. we mark 3 conflicts between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, between Hitler and Stalin. The first one was in August of 1940. This was more of a diplomatic trade disagreement. It gives us many of the characteristics that we bring to our day. We're going to go through this one in a fair amount of detail. First of all, August 1940, then Operation Barbarossa, the beginning of the Eastern Front when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and then 1945 when the Soviet Union pushed back. August of 1940, who initiated this breakdown in their alliance? It was the King of the South, the Soviet Union. Who came out the better for it? Barbarossa, who invaded who? Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Who came out better in the beginning of the Eastern Front? The North. 1945, they pushed their way into Germany. They met the Western forces on the Elbe River. They defeated Hitler, and it was victory for the South. In our history, we already have names for these 2 battles. We call them Raffia and Panium. Who do we say comes against who at Raffia? Based on Daniel 11. It's the South that comes against the North. And who wins? Panium. The North comes against the South and the North wins. This battle is 2018, it's already happened, and we're going to demonstrate that it's the North that came against the South and the South won. What do we notice? If this is Alpha and Omega, what do we notice? Are they the same? So for our Alpha history, we have the South come against the North and the North wins. The North comes against the South and the North wins. The South comes against the North and the South wins. That's an Alpha history. When we come down to an Omega history, we see that the North comes against the South and the South wins. The South comes against the North and the South wins. The North comes against the South and the North wins. So from the perspective of the King of the North, what is an Alpha history? How successful is an Alpha history for the King of the North? It's unsuccessful. For the King of the North, this is failure. And for an Omega? Success. So who's the King of the North in the history of World War II? Germany, Hitler. And how did that go for him? It's failure. For our history, we know it is the success of the King of the North. An Alpha history is only an Alpha because it's failure. If an Alpha history succeeded, there would be no need for a second attempt. It applies just as much when we apply it to Israel. If Israel had have done the right thing under Moses, would they have had the reform line of Christ? Would they have had to go through all the captivities and the suffering and the hundreds of years? If the Millerites had have been faithful in their history and not gone into Laodicea, would we have a history of the 144,000? No. It's specifically because this ends in disappointment and because there's failure that Christ did not come back in their time. And you can demonstrate that from the writings of Ellen White. She's very, very clear that Christ should have returned before 1888. And then he should have returned again in 1888 history. But he didn't. Because that history was not successful, there has to be a period of time, a period of captivity, and an Omega. So it's the exact same principle. While we learn from an alpha history, from a history of failure, there are differences. And we can see that when we go to the external and the battles. We can take 1945 and learn a great deal about Panium. And we can take August 1940 and it teaches us all about what happened in 2018. What we can't do is just drop everything straight down and take all of that box into 2018 without noticing a pattern, that there's differences. And it's the exact same thing when we take Millerite history and apply it to the line of the 144,000. I want to rub this out, if you don't mind. Actually, I might leave that part on the right side. I want to bring us kind of around a few different, a few things that might look disconnected, and I want to try and bring them together to make a point. I told you before that there's two ways to get to a study of the King of the South. We can do it through Acts 27 and go to 273 BC and start tracing these histories of Pyrrhus. And without going into the details of all the history, we've laid out the overall structure. What I want us to do is to actually, though, see it from the perspective of the counterfeit. I want us to go to that second subject of Daniel 11:40 and the counterfeit. So if you turn to Daniel 11 verse 40. We'll read Daniel 11 verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. How many histories is this talking about? Two. So when we have two things, what can we do to them? Compare and contrast. So we can take the first bit of Daniel 11 verse 40 and compare it to the second part of Daniel 11 verse 40. The first part is what history? It's the time of the end. It's 1798. So at 1798, it's the end of what time period? 1260. There's been 1260 years of papal persecution. And there's been an ongoing war between the King of the North and the King of the South. This is the history of the French Revolution. If you want to mark a specific battle between France and the papacy, it would be 1796. That's when the papal troops are defeated by Napoleon. So there is an ongoing struggle, a war, and even a battle in this history between France and the papacy. It all culminates in 1798. I want us to see there's this ongoing war. And then in 1798, what happens? Internally, if we were to just consider the internal, it's the time of the end. There's an increase of knowledge. The book of Daniel is unsealed. Napoleon captures the Pope. For you to turn to Revelation, Revelation 13:10. Revelation 13:10. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. So who is this talking about? The papacy, King of the North. What has the papacy been doing for 1260 years? He's been leading God's people into captivity. Because he led them into captivity, what has to happen to him? He has to go into captivity. What has he been doing to them for 1260 years? Killing them with the sword. So what has to happen to the papacy? He has to die by the sword. That becomes an important point. So we'll go to an Ellen White quote. Great Controversy 439.2. Power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And, says the prophet, I saw one of his heads as it was wounded to death. And again, he that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. The 42 months are the same as the time and times and the dividing of time, 3.5 years or 1260 days, the time during which the papal power was to oppress God's people. This period, as stated in preceding chapters, began with the supremacy of the papacy in AD 538 and terminated in 1798. At that time, the Pope was made captive by the French army, the papal power received its deadly wound, and the prediction was fulfilled, he that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. So what is she marking in 1798? The deadly wound. Now we read Revelation 13:10. How many parts in Revelation 13:10? You led into captivity, so you must go into captivity. What's the second part? You killed, so you must be killed. Can you see that? 1798, she says, fulfills which part? Sorry? The first part. They led into captivity, so they had to go into captivity. They literally went into captivity in 1798. What about the second part? Are they killed in 1798? I want to go to another Ellen White quote. 8 MR 354.1. This is a really good quote. 8 MR 354.1. She's in France. She says, that afternoon, it's November 2, there's an elder Bordeaux, a French elder, had us accompany him to the cathedral in Valence, France, and he took us to look upon the bust of Pius VI, who was noted in prophecy. Who's spoken about in prophecy? Pius VI. He was led into captivity and he died in captivity. So when was Pius VI led into captivity? When did he die in captivity? 1799. So this is the deadly wound. When is his death? Here was the one marked in history who received the deadly wound. His heart is encased in the marble monument beneath where the bust is located. We felt rather solemn as we looked upon the monument of this man noted in prophecy. When is Pius VI noted in prophecy? Revelation 13:10, because who is Revelation 13:10 talking about? The papacy, the kingdom, and the king. In Bible prophecy, can you separate the kingdom from the king? Where do we get that principle from? Daniel chapter 2. What happens in Daniel 2? Daniel shows to Nebuchadnezzar the statue. He shows him the head of gold and he says, this is Babylon and Medo Persia and Greece and Rome. But he also says that head of gold, it's not just Babylon, it's Nebuchadnezzar himself. It shows us that in prophecy, it gives us an important principle that you cannot separate a king from a kingdom, which is why we can take Pyrrhus and see that he isn't just one man. He isn't just Vladimir Putin, he's the king of the south in two histories. Because Pyrrhus doesn't just represent a man, a king, he represents a kingdom. And it's the same principle here. Pius VI doesn't just, the verse doesn't just represent the papacy, it also represents the king. So, 1798, this part is fulfilled. He led into captivity, therefore he had to become a captive. But he'd also killed for 1260 years, so there also had to be a death. 1798 marked the beginning of a fall. They lost their last pope with temporal power in 1799, when he died in captivity. And then what do we know happens? There must be a resurrection. So 1798, she says it fulfills part A. It fulfills the captivity. She doesn't say that 1798 fulfilled part B. That part of the fulfillment is with the death of the Pope. So if this is the structure for part A of Daniel 11 verse 40, what's the structure for part B? It has to follow the same pattern. 1989 is the end of a period of time. From 1863, it's a 126. This is a 1260, this is a 126. Has there been an ongoing war between the North and the South? What war is that? The Cold War. So you have the King of the North versus the King of the South. There's been an ongoing war. You come to 1989, it's the time of the end, and there's an increase of knowledge. But what is 1989 for the King of the South? Who is the King of the South? The Soviet Union. Does the Soviet Union end with the fall of the Berlin Wall? No. What does that do to the Soviet Union? It cripples it. It's a deadly wound that it's never able to recover from, and it marks the beginning of its fall. And it falls progressively until 1991, and its death. The King of the South does not end in 1989. This is the deadly wound, and we've already discussed this when we went to, you can do this from the line of Pyrrhus, we saw it with Acts 27, that where we mark Panium, it's just a deadly wound. It begins a fall as the United States comes up as as the only world superpower. So this history is repeated in this history. But when we see a waymark marked in prophecy, what is continually being highlighted is not the death but the wounding. So when we see 1798 or 1989 or Panium, these are the battles being marked, and they, even in history, they end up being the most famous landmarks that people look back to. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the newspapers commented on this incident as being so much less significant than the fall of the Berlin Wall. They said this was the one that we all remembered and were amazed by. By the time it died, no one was even really surprised. We were just so used to the concept that it was ending. It's this one that gets the attention, both historically and in prophecy. But you can see that it only marks the beginning of the fall, the beginning of an inevitable fall. So based on this principle, what do we know had to happen to the King of the South after 1991? It had to resurrect. It couldn't be finished in that history. I want us to consider the king of the south received a deadly wound and it died. So we've compared and contrasted, we've used the rules of parable teaching to compare the king of the north and the king of the south. But what about captivity? How do we treat captivity? Why does a power go into captivity? It's disobedient. So when you go to Daniel 2, I think we know Daniel 2 fairly well. And I think people are becoming comfortable with the fact I can't draw. So there's a statue. It kind of has 4 parts. What's this statue composed of? Kingdoms. So it's Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And if you go to Daniel 11, what does it call all of those kingdoms? They're beasts. If you go to, don't know my chapters, but they're either wild beasts or they're counterfeit sanctuary animals. That should give us a clue. If they're counterfeit sanctuary animals, what are they counterfeiting? But when you go to Daniel 11, what does it call all these kingdoms? It gives one name to all of them. If you go to Daniel 11, what is Rome in Daniel 11 and Greece in Daniel 11? King of the north. Are we okay with that? That Babylon was the king of the north, Medo-Persia took over and became the king of the north, then Alexander and Greece became king of the north, and then Rome became king of the north. So this statue is composed of the king of the north. And it's being compared and contrasted, lined up with another structure. And what is this structure? It's the mountain and the stone. If this is a counterfeit, because it is illustrated by counterfeit sanctuary animals, what's it counterfeiting? Who's the true king of the north? Christ. Why does Satan want to be the king of the north? We won't look there for time, but I'll give you the references. Psalm 48:2. Psalm 48:2 says, "Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, on the sides of the north, the city of the great king." The city of God is described as being on the side of the north. Isaiah 14:13. Isaiah 14:13 says of Satan, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north." So when Satan wants to create this king of the north, what he's wanting to do is counterfeit God, because he sees that God is the true king of the north. So if this is the king of the north and this is the king of the north, where is the king of the south? Who's the boss of this? This is Satan. Who's the boss of this? So where's the king of the south fit into this picture? Where does Islam fit into this picture? If we were to come to the history of World War II, what's Satan trying to do with the king of the north? Hitler's gone into an alliance with the papacy. They're trying to take over the world. Who's their number one enemy? No.
The Constitution of the United States.
No. They don't care. The United States isn't that relevant to Hitler. Who's their number one enemy?
Second front.
The second front, what did Hitler say? I think it was the ambassador from Britain. What did Hitler say to him? The West are fools. You don't all know. All I want is the Soviet Union. You're standing in my way. If you didn't stop standing in my way, I wouldn't fight you. I'd only fight him because he's all that I want. That's how the papacy knew who to line up with. Matthew 12:26. Matthew 12:26. We'll look at two verses. Matthew 12:26 and Mark 3:26. Matthew 12:26. And if Satan cast out Satan, he's divided against himself. How shall then his kingdom stand? Mark 3:26. And if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath an end. What can Satan not do? Be divided against himself. So what's happening in world? Is he? Where's communism in this? Where's Egypt in this? It's not there. There is no king of the south in this statue because the king of the south is not part of Satan's kingdom. The king of the south has no boss. Atheistic France in the French Revolution, who did they fight against? And just the papacy? They fought against the papacy and against God. They make no distinction. They're in complete rebellion to both. So when you come to the history of World War II, who's Hitler's number one enemy? Russia, Stalin, the king of the south. And Satan has not created a kingdom that's divided against himself. He knows, Christ has told him what he already knows. He cannot afford to do that. He cannot set up two kingdoms that are completely opposed to one another and expect to establish himself. So when we come to this statue, this King of the North statue, they come under a boss. That's Satan. When we come to the mountain or God's kingdom, it's also represented by the King of the North. They come under a boss. This is God's kingdom. You do not find the King of the South in the statue. Are we all okay with that? So what you end up with is independent ministries. Like atheistic France or communist Russia, they're in opposition not just to God but also to Satan. This is the opposite side of the coin to the nature of man. If you can be morally good without God, you can be morally wicked without Satan. Who tempted Satan in heaven? No one. He had the power of his own will, and using his own will, he decided to lead the angels in rebellion. It's the exact same thing when it comes to the King of the South. Using his own will, he does not need an outside influence to do the work that he does. Stalin did not need an outside influence. We can be good by exercising our own will. We can be wicked by exercising our own will. It's called the freedom of choice. So God's kingdom. What problems does God have with his kingdom? What can God's church do against him? We can disobey him. We can be rebellious. We can be difficult. We could call that apostasy. And when we go into apostasy, what happens? You go into captivity. This is what I want us to consider. We can compare and contrast the King of the North and the King of the South when we're talking about a deadly wound and a death. But when we're talking about captivity, it's punishment for apostasy. The King of the South cannot go into captivity. There is no story where the King of the South goes into captivity as a punishment for apostasy. So if we were to talk about God's kingdom, they go into apostasy. So what does God do? He punishes them. Who does he bring? They go into apostasy. This brings about a captivity. Who does God bring against them? All the kings of the north. There's a verse for that. We'll look up that verse. I'll just give you the reference. I might do that next presentation because I can't find it right now. Does anyone know it? Jeremiah 25:9. Jeremiah 25:9 says, "Behold, I will send and take all of the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against all the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them." So God, does Babylon become part of God's kingdom? No. But God calls Babylon his servant, Nebuchadnezzar his servant. So he uses it. He uses something that is outside his own kingdom. God brings the king of the north against his own people. The king of the north is not part of his kingdom. So if we were to consider Satan, if the king of the north goes into captivity, if the papacy goes into captivity in 1798, what has happened? Why does the papacy go into captivity? Keep with our parable. Why do they go into captivity? Keep with the parable. Disobedience, who said that? Disobedience, apostasy. You go into captivity as a punishment for apostasy. When did the papacy go into apostasy against their boss? 1773. The kings of Europe give the papacy two choices. The kings of Europe sent their ambassadors to the Catholic Church and they gave them two choices. Lose your temporal prosperity. Give up to us some of your territory and your wealth. Or abolish the Jesuit order. For 1260 years, the papacy, under their boss, Satan, has had a job description: control the kings of Europe and persecute and kill God's people. Who's doing that for them? The Jesuits. The Jesuit order is founded to fulfill that job function. They control the kings of Europe and they orchestrate the persecution on God's people. In 1773, what condition is the papal church gone into? They've sunk into a Laodicean condition where they choose temporal prosperity, covetousness over their job function. They're given the exact same choice that we're given. You can line up the test for the Catholic Church and the test for Adventism. Do we want to fulfill our job function or do we want temporal prosperity? They're given that choice in 1773, and what did they decide to do? Abolish the Jesuit order. They stopped. This is why. What does Ellen White say about 1773? She says 25 years before 1798, persecution almost wholly ceased. Why did persecution almost wholly cease 25 years before 1798? That takes you to 1773 and the abolishing of the Jesuit order. That's why the persecution of God's people ceased. It's when the Catholic Church stopped fulfilling their job function. And when they stopped fulfilling their job function, who are they in rebellion to? Their boss. So what's going to happen to them? Who is he going to bring? Did God bring his own people against Israel? No, they're a separate entity, but he uses them. Does Satan bring his own people against Babylon? No, he brings the king of the south because he uses them, but they are not his people. So when we tell the story of deadly wound and death, we can compare and contrast the king of the north and the king of the south. But when we talk about apostasy and captivity, we have to use a different parable because the king of the south cannot go into an apostasy to a boss they don't have. We have to talk about the true and the counterfeit. We have to talk about Israel and Babylon. So Israel went into captivity for how many years? Let's call this 538. How many years did they go into captivity for? 1260 years until 1798. And they come up as modern Israel. We're okay with that. They come up as modern Israel. So Babylon, 1798, they go into captivity. They're going to resurrect. And they're going to come up as modern Babylon. Are we all okay with that? We're okay. When modern Israel comes out of captivity, how many histories does it come in? 2. There's an Alpha and an Omega of modern Israel. Millerite history, 144,000 history. If there's an Alpha and Omega of modern Israel, compare and contrast, what must there be for modern Babylon? There must be an Alpha and an Omega of modern Babylon. So after 1798, after the captivity of the papacy, when they come back into history, you must see them in 2 parts. You must see them in an Alpha and an Omega. What brings modern Israel out of captivity in 1798? After the deadly wound and then the death, what brings prophecy? What type of prophecy? I'm looking for a specific phrase that we've been largely led by in this movement. What brings Israel out of captivity? Revelation 14. What's a neat phrase that we use for that? A 3-step prophetic testing message. What brings us out is a 3-step prophetic testing message. And that 3-step message is what? What's the first one? Fear God. Give glory. Because judgment is coming. The king of the north is a counterfeit of a king of the north. What brings modern Babylon out of captivity? A 3-step prophetic testing message. Parable teaching allows you to accept and have a firm platform beneath your feet to accept truth when you're relatively new to this message. You can see just through parable teaching, You can see the resurrection of the King of the South, the fact that it comes back after 1991, the compare and the contrast. You can also see the importance of the World War II history. When does Babylon get their 3-step prophetic testing message? Fatima. The 3 secrets of Fatima. And what are they? What's the first secret the children are given? The first thing that they see is the ground open up, and they're given a vision of an eternally burning hell, and they're terrified. They're around 7, 8, 10 years old. Fear Satan. What's the third? They're shown a vision of the Catholic clergy, from the Pope down to the cardinals and the bishops and the lay people, led up a mountain and then assassinated. What is that? They understood it as a message of judgment. How do you give Satan glory? What are they asked to do?
Consecrate
Russia, the King of the South. If you were to go to Revelation, it says that before the birth of Christ, the dragon was, what was the dragon ready to do? Devour the child. Before its birth, it's already positioning itself to devour the child as soon as it's born. What history is this? What year? 1917. What's happening in Russia in 1917? The Bolshevik Revolution. The revolution starts in March. The Bolsheviks don't take power until November. This happens it begins about March and ends in October. Before the Bolsheviks and Lenin have even taken control of Russia, the dragon is already ready to devour the child before it's born. It's repeating history. They have a 3-step prophetic testing message designed to bring them out of a state of captivity. Why does this 3-step prophetic testing message, giving them their job function, not go to Rome and the leadership of the Catholic Church? Why doesn't it go to the Pope and the Vatican?
They didn't bring all the people together at the right time.
And I'm not going that far ahead. They hadn't accepted it. But why hasn't the message itself gone to Rome? Because they're in apostasy to their boss. And when you're in apostasy to your boss, what does God do? He bypasses the leadership and he finds someone else. Whether it's the shepherds on the hill, or it's William Miller, or it's John the Baptist, or it's Elder Jeff, he's going to find someone else. So for the counterfeit, when he has to bring his church out of a state of captivity, he finds he cannot go to the leadership. Their morality doesn't matter. You can be a good person or a bad person and decide that I would rather sit in my golden palace than anyone's will, whether that's God's will or Satan's will. So he finds 3 children. Millerite history, how many people were given visions? 3. How many went through? 1. 3 children are given visions. 2 died in 1919, 1920. 1 goes through and she's a prophet for the Catholic Church for the next about 80 years. We're going to come back and look at the history of 1917 and what the Alpha and Omega can teach us. If you'll kneel with me in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for your goodness to us, your kindness to us. Thank you that you've led us so far and that you continue to lead us. I pray that we'll have faith in our leadership, faith in how you have guided us for the last 30 years. And I pray that even now we'll identify truth from error and feel that we have a strong reason to believe what we do. I pray, Lord, that you'll cement us in these things. May we be firm in them. May we think about them and the implications of them. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.